link via the chat box. Please feel free to share it with your network for them to also tune in as well. We encourage your participation in this webinar by sending your questions and comments through the Q&A box right at the bottom of the Zoom, and also through the chat box. We are also receiving comments and questions via the Facebook comments section and as the moderators, and we will be channeling this to the panelists. Now, moderating this session today is Lucy Waringi, who is the Executive Director of the African Conservation Center. Lucy has had a long interest in the management and interpretation of biological and environmental data for decision-making at all levels and informing initiatives that enhance local livelihoods in rich biodiversity areas. So thanks again for joining us, and welcome, Lucy.
Thank you, Evelyn, and welcome everyone to this webinar. We are excited to collaborate in hosting this yet again. And today we want to go a notch higher. Everyone through COVID, of course, has been trying to figure out how do we do things differently? What have we learned through this COVID period that enables us to reflect and project our work with different parameters in mind? And even though most of us represented here have the interest around conservation and environment, I think if there's one thing COVID has shown us is that we cannot look at any sector in a silo, that we must integrate our actions in a manner that brings holistic value and holistic impact across various sectors. And so in today's session, beyond looking at how we build back better from an environmental and conservation perspective, we're also trying to look at how do we, in building back better, integrate and enable a framework that causes us to talk across sectors, that helps us to see the value propositions between sectors, and enables us to realize that none of us can isolate our mechanisms of how we build back without looking at all the other development arms. So today we're really privileged to really have an integrative approach in how we look at this discussion. And we have generally 4 outcomes we are hoping we will have at the end of this session. One is that we'll be able to bring out the key conservation and development issues that need to be considered in the light of this pandemic to ensure we are building resilience, both for people and for nature. Secondly, we want to see how we can create opportunities for institutions to start planning more effectively in the future, perhaps in a more collaborative manner, and also with some hindsight on other sectors that we may in the past have ignored. And thirdly, we want to see how we build convergence between institutions who have their individual mandates that may look different, but definitely can find convergence points to build back stronger. And finally, we hope that our interaction will enable us to influence the places we work and the countries we represent and the sectors that we impact, and be able to provide influence that will enable us to build back better. So welcome again. And I would like to present to you our panelists. We have a team of 3 very interesting panelists who are going to be sharing with us through this 1.5 hours that we have together. We're led by Alice Ruweza, who's the Africa Region Director. She's going to be giving the lead well, they're all leading in their presentations because their presentations have a different focus. But Alice will be the first one on the floor, and she's the Regional Director for One Wildlife Fund International. And she leads and oversees a regional program comprising 10 countries and 400 staff. And she's leading the design of a new conservation framework that brings together work at national level, transboundary level, and global levels. Alice has a bachelor degree in social sciences from Makerere University in Uganda and a master's degree in agricultural and applied economics from the University of Wisconsin in the USA. She is an Aspen New Voices Senior Fellow, a Henry Arnold Conservation Fellow, and a Fellow of the Salzburg Global Seminar. She sits on the boards of the CGIAR, the Global Evergreening Alliance, and is in the steering committee of the Future Earth of Water, Food, and Energy Nexus. And so we're really looking to listening to Alice. I was going to introduce the other 2 panelists, but I think it is better I introduce them just before their session. Otherwise, you're not going to remember everyone's profile very well. So, but all the panelists, we have Josphat Ngonyo and Lisa Parrott. I will introduce them, and Michael O'Brien will be making some wrap-up remarks, but allow me to do their proper introduction during their sessions. So I'm going to hand over now to Alice, and Alice is going to open up the discussion for us around building back a green and a just recovery. Over to you, Alice, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for that introduction. And also thank you to my colleagues at the Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group and other partners at Save the Children and others, and of course the Africa Conservation Center for organizing this webinar. Okay, so my job today is to set the scene and to talk about building back better after COVID-19, especially relating to nature. So I think we've all heard a lot about the challenges. Africa is experiencing a triple health, economic and environmental challenge. The IMF has just given us the worst estimate, predicting that the GDP will drop to between 1.7 and 3.4 overall. Many reasons: the decrease in economic activity by major trading partners, especially China, the reduction in tourism flows that we all know about, the global price drop in commodities, the greater risk aversion by investors and FDI, foreign direct investment, dropping by between 25%, and also the drop in overseas migrant remittances, which have always been important. But for today, I don't want to really focus on the challenges. I actually want to focus on the opportunity that this pandemic provides to us to be able to build back better. In fact, to build better, because Africa is still building and Africa is building. So it's more like building forward better. And especially to talk about nature as a launch pad of that recovery. So, and I'll go a little bit sector by sector, borrowing from a policy brief that we've just published that you may have seen around building back better. So when we talk about health, let's talk about health and food security. We know that Africa is facing challenges with a hospital bed capacity of only 1.8 per 1,000 people on average, and long-term health challenges. But we also know that there are many opportunities that nature plays in ensuring that in improving our health, and actually maybe ensuring that we don't even need to go to hospital in the first place, and therefore that bed capacity then doesn't become a challenge. And let's talk about mental health, for example. There's a lot of evidence around the role that nature plays through providing open spaces and clean air. I just read about a clinic in Rwanda that was designed with open air spaces and clean air and ended up in increasing maternal health and decreasing child mortality. And we can also talk about healthy diets. Look at our traditional foods, our orphan crops that are less vulnerable to the disruptions in global supply chains that we've been suffering with due to COVID. So when we have healthy diets and we use our traditional foods, which grow happily here and are well adapted to the environment, all of that results in less habitat conversion. It's better nutrition, it's less pollution from pesticides, and ultimately less exposure to pandemics. Poverty and livelihoods is another area that has been pointed out as a big challenge. And yes, we know that we already had poverty. You had a lot of high percentage of people employed in the informal economy. And COVID-19 has worsened that and wiped out years of gains. But you can also look at some opportunities. For example, we know a lot of people have moved from the urban to the rural areas. Is it an opportunity now then for Africa to focus on building our rural areas? Is there an opportunity for us to harness this redistribution of human capital from urban to rural areas and really build our rural areas and power our rural areas with our renewable energy and access to solar power, for example, reduce the use of fuel wood? That would be another thing to do. For the numbers don't lie. Already the numbers are showing that 3 times as many jobs are created per year, by $1 million in renewable energy than in using fossil fuels. So there is an opportunity to build back better just by focusing on that. Tourism is one area that we've all heard about, loss of 50 billion, 7 times greater than the 2008 crisis. But And we know we've lost financing for our protected areas, and we know that our communities that live near protected areas that have been dependent on tourism are affected. But there's also an opportunity for us to start diversifying now and looking at other sources of finance for our conservation beyond tourism. There's an opportunity for us to recognize the value of nature, just nature itself, that goes beyond us just looking at the value of nature through tourism. Between 30 and 50% of the total wealth in Africa comes from our natural capital. So being able to look at that value of natural capital in a different lens now, without looking at it through tourism, and really taking advantage of that. Another challenge that we've seen a lot is the run in the fiscal space. The long-term debt, the high interest rates, our countries are borrowing, and our borrowing rates are much higher than everywhere in the world. But now is an opportunity that we start to make the case for investment in nature, for investing in nature and getting better returns from this investment. We're seeing a lot of the private sector stepping up, showing some interest in investing in nature. Recently, there was an article around asset classes for pollination in the Financial Times. We know that $1 spent on nature restoration yields $9 in economic benefit. That's huge. So these green jobs that can employ people to restore ecosystems are going to be important. And guess what? They also result in reduced climate change impacts, and which is what we are really vulnerable to. Ethiopia, for example, is already stepping up and going to plant 5 billion seedlings a year. That's huge. Those are jobs that are coming out of this recovery. We also know that $1 spent on sustainable infrastructure yields $4 in benefits. So rehabilitate our watersheds instead of building dams, renewable energy instead of investing in power plants. And guess what that means? That means that our countries are going to reduce their debt, because most of the time our borrowing is usually for infrastructure. So the way forward, in terms of what do we want our policymakers to do? Yes, we want to build back better, we want to build green, but we also want to see equality and equity. So we know that income inequality is a central problem in this, and if we do not deal with that, we will not be able to even build back better. So we need to ensure benefits are equally shared equitably, to ensure all Africans realize the opportunities provided by this recovery. And also, we also want to see the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities as well. Our youth, our vibrant youth, a great opportunity for us. They're already raising their voices for nature. We can build on that. They have a stake in the future, so it's a great opportunity to work with them. We need to measure and communicate the benefits of investing in nature, including the avoided costs of climate change. Our policymakers will see value in investing in nature if we can show them the avoided costs of this. And I think most important and last of all is we need partnerships. And that's why integration, as Lucy talked about, and also the theme of this webinar is extremely important. It's extremely important to have Lisa here from Save the Children, for example, because we know that going forward, we're not going to resolve these if we do not have these multi-stakeholder partnerships with the development and the humanitarian arena. So this is extremely important for us also going forward. And last but not least, the political will is growing. Just the recently ended UN Biodiversity Summit, we saw all our heads of state stepping up with ambitious goals for the 2020, for the new biodiversity framework. And therefore, the time is now, and it's time for us to seize the moment. Thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Alice. And you've really raised the pitch of our imagination of what is possible and also what is needed. And just highlighting in dollar terms, because governments understand dollar signs, when you present those before them, the facts that you're sharing, that $1 in nature gives us $9 economic benefit, that $1 in sustainable infrastructure gives us $4 in benefit. These are just not just the messages that we need to speak about, but we need to find the methods that bring the paradigm shift to begin appreciating some of these benefits that you're describing. I think the whole aspect of measurement that you highlight is lacking. So people are not able to measure what nature is offering, neither are they able to really measure the benefits that they're accruing from nature. So thank you for opening that up, and I'm hoping as we go into the discussion, we'll really begin to unpack what does this mean in our respective countries and in our regions, and what do we need to do to turn the key and get some of those partnerships that bring about the appreciation of this value. So thank you for bringing that on. And I'd like us to now shift. But before we shift, to remind you that we have a Q&A button that you can use to put your questions, which will be answered through this session and also at the end. But also, if you have additional insights that you'd like to share and you think are relevant to each of the 3 sections that we will be covering, please feel free to put that in. I'd like us to shift now from that global picture that Alice has so ably pointed out to us, to now look at some of the practical ways of engagement with communities. And we're going to be I would like to introduce to you Josphat Ngonyo, whose session is really now going to bring us to the practical application of how do we build resilience and building back better, or to add to Alice's word, building forward with people and with communities. How do we make that a reality? And it relates to us enabling, ensuring we have equity, even as communities that that get the brunt of some of the downturns of climate. How do we engage communities effectively? And so let me introduce Josphat Ngonyo, who is the founder and executive director of the African Network for Animal Welfare, that we like calling ANO. It's the largest indigenous hands-on Pan-African non-governmental organization that promotes humane treatment of all animals across the continent by working with communities and governments, partners, and other stakeholders. They have representatives in 25 countries, and Josphat's role is in leading the strategic focus that ensures this mandate, both in practice and also in policy. And through ANO, they have had a platform of conferences initiated through a tripartite partnership with UN Environment, AU IBA, and ANO to champion and advocate for the integration of animal welfare, wildlife, and environmental conservation into the continent's policies and strategies so that we achieve sustainable development goals in Africa. Josphat has worked extensively in wildlife conservation and animal welfare for over 20 years. He has an MBA from the African Leadership University School of Business, and earlier on a Bachelor of Education degree from Moi University, and also a diploma in the management of not-for-profit organizations. Josphat serves on the boards of the African Network for Animal Welfare, USA, and Compassion in the World Farming, United Kingdom. He's an honorary warden appointed by the Kenya Wildlife Service. And we really have the pleasure of welcoming you, Josphat, to bring us down to the ground and see how do we engage communities to influence these actions that we hopefully will result in impact across the continent of Africa. Karibu, Josphat.
Hello, can you hear me now?
We can hear you quite well, Josphat.
Oh, great. Thank you very much, Alice, for those very kind words. Yes, indeed, my colleague Alice has talked about involvement of communities and youth and indigenous populations, and I come to bring that connection. In addition to the introduction that Lucy has given, I would say that I grew up in a village bordering Tsavo East National Park, and I was inspired. My uncle, who is nearly 90 years old now, who was a ranger driver in Tsavo National Park, inspired me a great deal into conservation. So as indicated, with African Network for Animal Welfare, our vision is of a continent where animals are free from pain, injury, and disease, discomfort, fear, and distress, hunger, and thirst, and free to exercise normal behavior. I would just like to speak briefly on adaptive leadership. Practically, as an organization, we employed 3 A's principle, where we accepted, working with our leadership team in the organization, accepted that the pandemic is a reality, adjusted and looked at how can we really change to flow with the new reality. And we found that we could move our office to a cheaper office, and also we found that we could also adjust on our pay, particularly considering pension in line with the legal requirements. So we managed to do that, and we looked at the impact of the transition, and indeed, I would say that we were very fortunate to just have one position that was redundant. However, as an organization, we did all that we could as humanly possible to cushion that individual and to make sure that the transition was smooth. So this leads us to the final A, which was advance. We looked at how do we advance going forward, and going again by the regulations, government requirements, we found that we could indeed work from home, and we realized actually we were achieving much more. So we only go to the office when it's absolutely necessary for meetings, or when we need maybe to brainstorm on an issue or something. So that is our application, a practical application of the principle. Factors impacting communities resilience. I have a few where we see a threatened global ecosystem, where we actually see that one aspect of what happened at a local environment impacted the global, and we see that we are all affected by an incident that happened locally. So the entire globe is connected, by diversity, nature. We are all connected, and then there's also biodiversity loss. We have seen that there is a lot of, and my colleague Alice has alluded to it. There's quite a huge impact. We have inequality in the society. Again, we have seen some people benefiting more, and if you look at communities, a lot of communities were impacted negatively in this time of COVID-19. Some lost incomes, and we see that some heavily relied on maybe selling products to tourism. To tourists, but with tourism restrictions, that was not possible anymore. Again, we see the need for stronger systems for communities to survive. The communities need to have established the systems that are resilient to shocks that come with the crises such as this pandemic. Yes, so I would just glide on key conservation and development issues for consideration in pandemic situation to ensure resilience of communities and people. And again, I would say that nature and—
Sorry, Josephat, could I interrupt you for a second? I really apologize.
Go ahead.
Allow me to interrupt you and request that you perhaps, if you could shut your PowerPoint and open it again. Okay. It seems to have rendered not so clearly. I'm sure it's clear on your side, but it's rendered not so clearly for the viewers. Yeah,
Thank you.
and
Let
then
me
load
do
it
that.
again. I think it will be better. Thank you.
Yes. Let me do that. And
Okay.
okay. All right. Okay. Let me just share. Is it better now?
Let's see. For some reason, it's still pixelated. I'm not sure why.
Let me change network. There is which will to a network that will give me more robust share. Sorry about
and maybe, do you have several slides running, or is that the only program that's open? Just
that is the only one.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So let me see. Okay, are we better there? Is it
Let's
better?
try. Maybe you can share. Let's see. It's not yet on. Have you clicked on share?
Yes. Let me start this. Okay. Okay.
Are you able to see the button for screen share?
Yes, I am there. I'm seeing the button for screen share. Okay. Okay. So.
The other option, maybe you can let us know what you're seeing on your side.
Okay, let me try now and see. I am sharing again.
All right, so, it has shared. Okay, it's sharing your Zoom screen.
Okay.
Hi, Joseph. Kindly stop that there.
Can you see it now?
No, it's a blank screen.
It's a blank screen. Okay.
The other option, Josephat, because your presentation, we were hearing you very clearly and we can follow. The other option then is you can proceed and just, if it's clear on your end, you can read it and just proceed.
Okay. So
and if there are slides you really want us to see,
Okay. All right. Can you see it now?
Much better. Much better. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic.
Much better.
Sorry
so
about that.
You can move on. I think you're on slide number 4. Not
yes.
to worry.
Let me get
Much
there.
Better. Thank you.
Okay. So
excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay,
Thank you.
Great.
Excellent.
Great. Thanks and apologies once again. So we see that there's need for a stronger support system to cushion pandemics, and then I'd mentioned, and then inequality in the society, communities. This time we realized that communities were just a step away from abject poverty. There was wide gap, Some of the, as I indicated, there's some of these communities that did not have any benefit in the wildlife sector, it was quite a challenge for them. Sources of income, we see communities adversely affected. Biodiversity loss, we have 52% global decline and 65% continental, that is from 1970 to 2016, and also 68% since 1970. And you can see generally the COVID-19, poaching and biodiversity loss have been exacerbated through COVID-19 pandemic. So I would say that ANO, in partnership with Kenya Wildlife Service and other partners, have been doing wildlife anti-poaching dictionary and animal rescues for 13 years. And before the pandemic, the statistics were 1 to 2 animal rescues in a day. But during the pandemic, we've had a 50% increase to 3 to 4 animals daily, which is really alarming. And please, I would like us to see this very short clip that showcases that challenge. Thank you very much. That is actually a tip of the iceberg because the problem is much more. Monday before last, we had 3 lions, 2 hyenas, and 1 eland, all dead in snares in one of the wildlife areas in one of the conservancies in the Mara. And what this indicates is that we have a bigger problem. So key drivers of wildlife poaching for bushmeat. I am privileged to have done a study with the communities called or entitled Building Development Linkages that Empower Local Communities for Sustainable Wildlife Conservation. This was during my MBA study with the University, African Leadership University School of Business. And the question, one of the question I asked is what drives poaching for bushmeat? And these were the answers I got: unemployment, lack of gainful compensation of work, and then lack of income generating alternatives to bushmeat trade, and also that bushmeat is generally cheaper in comparison to livestock meat. So the communities go for those because because of those factors. And let's look at the opportunities to build back better. I see that we need to include communities to participate in order to reduce conflicts and revitalize economies. These communities live with wildlife. You know, tourists maybe would go to, or some of us would just go to a wildlife area or an area where the communities live with wildlife once in a while. But they are with the animals day in and day out, so they need to be included. Public support towards community-led initiatives, that is crucial. It's important that we support them, whatever it is, maybe tourism, maybe conservancy, maybe some initiative that will ensure that these communities put money in their pockets and put food on their tables. Empowering communities, and through the study, we were led to establish Africa Conservation Education Fund because this is what people needed. We asked what did they need in order to stop poaching activities, and they said they need to be empowered through formal education and vocational training. That was 88.5% of the respondents who said that, and it was actually an overwhelming response. Sustainability. We need to look at diversity of sources of income for the communities to fund themselves. Food security systems that ensure survival and recovery. And also, we need generally to enhance networking. This is organizations, communities, and everyone in this sector, in conservation and natural resources. This is because virtual communication is now a reality. We can build strong bonds. We can establish virtual tour experiences where tourists now can get their tour destination experience, and the money that is generated from this can help the affected communities. Lessons learned towards building more resilience, internal adaptation is very, very important. Look inwards, perpetuate or enhance internal resource optimization. That is important, because there is something good that each organization, each individual has, and that this is the time, during the time of crisis, is the time to bring it out. Stimulating behavior change, and awareness, education, capacity building, empowerment of these communities and the people, particularly through formal education and vocational training, is crucial. And my colleague Lisa from Save the Children will talk more from humanitarian development. That is important, working together in partnership and in cooperation with all stakeholders. And also, we realize, as a lesson learned, actually, I think most important lesson, because we have been removing the snares and doing the animal rescues for 13 years as Africa Network for Animal Welfare. But we realize that is not the solution. That is just a patch. The solution is empowerment of communities. And therefore, this is what we are calling upon, because we have done a research, we have gotten feedback, and we know that however much we focus on species conservation, it is good to do that. But if we want to resolve the conservation challenge, population decline, biodiversity loss, then we have to partner with communities and ensure that they are actually part of the solution, and they're willing, they just are seeking that empowerment. So the call is to integrate communities in our efforts to prevent further biodiversity loss and future pandemics. Indeed, you may have noted, we have talked about poaching, we've talked about wildlife markets, wildlife trade. All these involve communities. There is no way and that these activities can take place without the knowledge of and involvement of the communities that live with wildlife or live next to wildlife areas. So survival of wildlife is in relationship with people. We need to have a paradigm shift, a mindset to this realization that as long as we leave people out, then we are our work, our efforts are in vain. And therefore, without single-minded focus on communities empowerment and development, we will all have supervised the decimation of wildlife as we watch. So losing species at alarming rate, such as Rothschild giraffes, pangolins, chimpanzees, this is happening. But we can do something, we can all intervene, and I call upon all the governments, policymakers, the donors, and philanthropists, colleague organizations in the NGO world, conservation organizations or animal welfare, and also UN agencies involved in environment and biodiversity conservation, global environment facilities, and even African Union Inter-Africa Bureau for Animal Resources, and an arm of the African Union. If we could only intervene towards empowering communities who live with wildlife, because empowering communities will lead to healthy ecosystems that allow wildlife to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephat. Thank you for that overview of the challenges at community level that really threaten the very conservation we care about. Thank you also for the video clip that shows the reality of what that challenge looks like. And I've heard you say things that resonate a lot with what was set out even from our first speaker. You've talked about inclusiveness. You've talked about integration. You've talked about empowerment. And it is quite evident that we're saying without linkages that develop these communities, then our conservation agenda is threatened. So I think the message is consistent with what we're seeing at the global need, but on the practice on the ground, it's actually confirming that communities must be at the center, and that center involves their livelihoods, which is really a development agenda. So really thank you for that great presentation. We have some questions already on the Q&A. Thank you people for bringing in those questions. I would like to perhaps the discussion more integrated because we're talking about integration. I'd actually like to introduce the third speaker so that we will keep, remember, different baskets we have discussed this afternoon. Keep your questions coming, but I'd like to introduce our third speaker, and then I will review the various questions that have been presented, because we'd like to see how we can integrate the responses across the different panelists. So I'm now going to introduce to us Ms. Lisa Parrott. She's the Regional Program and Quality Director of Save the Children. And we're really delighted to have, let us say, an unusual panelist in a conservation webinar, but it's really about breaking those barriers of keeping things in silos to really having more integration, because the environment is similar for all platforms. The people are the same in all these platforms. So we are looking forward to listening to Lisa. And Lisa, who heads this regional program in East and Southern Africa, has been working in Sub-Saharan Africa for almost 20 years with a technical background in economic development, financial services, food security, and livelihoods. She currently oversees quality implementation and impact measurement in 14 countries where Save the Children operate programs. Her team leads monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning across the portfolio, ensuring that there's strong evidence of impact. In addition to managing this regional partnership, she works with donors and represents Save the Children's portfolio with government and partner stakeholders. She has a master's degree in public administration and policy and a Bachelor of Arts in business. So we welcome you, Lisa, and we look forward to hearing your perspectives on, from your experience in how we can integrate better as we build back and as we build forward and enhance that integration across the different sectors. Karibu.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to both Josephat and Alice for really setting the stage and giving us both the macro environment. Alice laid out many of the challenges that COVID has posed to the community and to working in community development and conservation, as well as some of the very specific examples that Josephat shared, which I think help illustrate how important it is to think really at that community engagement level. And I think COVID has shown us that if we want effective risk communication, be able and have the ability to speak into communities about what the risks are of a pandemic like COVID, we really need to strengthen our ability to engage with communities, and that's where the interface happens with both wildlife and nature. I think that doesn't set aside some of the issues that Alice also pointed out on the policy level, on the larger structural issues that are happening around debt, around the larger economic questions that are happening globally. But what I'm going to do is focus a bit of my discussion to help us integrate on children in this equation all over the world. Save the Children recently released a report called Protect a Generation. I know Alice referred to a report that has come out as well, and I think these pivotal reports really point us in the direction of some solutions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings in our report and how they can link into what Alice was proposing. And I think we'll start to see that intersection of both what we're trying to do on the humanitarian side and what we can do in the conservation area as well. So we did research across the globe and spoke to more than 31,000 caregivers and parents. We also talked to children and got the input from more than 13,000 children. And collectively, we saw that there's really a need in some very specific areas. We all know that the pandemic has resulted in lost income. And our research shows that more than 77% of the parents and caregivers experienced a loss in income because of the situation. We also know that 89% of the people who spoke to us during this research have experienced impact on their access to healthcare and health services, including access to medicine. We also know that 1.6 billion children are out of school, and we're in the process of getting them back to school. So we can see that there's clear impacts on the livelihood situation, the health situation, and the education system. And I think Alice also referred to the mental health and some of the greater impacts that this is having on all of us, both children and parents. So I think those three areas give us some areas, or give us a focus on where we can start to make some progress. We know that because of the stress on livelihoods, and anytime that human development is impacted, we're going to see potentially a threat to the environment and wildlife. We can see this in the poaching that Josephat so clearly outlined, but bigger impacts like deforestation in an attempt to either secure livelihoods, to trade in timber products, or to create opportunities for fuel, or to open up space for agriculture. We've also seen more pressure on land. Alice talked about the movement of people from urban areas into rural areas, and more people are shifting their livelihoods into farming in hopes of being able to secure food for their family. We also saw a question in the Q&A, but also think more broadly, we've been talking about the impacts on tourism and how that whole industry, particularly in Africa, has been affected. We also might see the government deprioritize some of the investments that they've made in climate smart activities or in protecting the environment in favor of having to respond to the health crisis. So you can understand the tough choices that governments are having to make around budgets. So what can we do? We see there's clearly some problems. We've all been talking about them. How do we bring both our humanitarian response, focused not only on children, but on communities more broadly? How can we use that to build better, or to continue to move forward and build strong intersection with conservation and what we're trying to do to protect the environment? Well, I would present you with three areas that all of us can think about, whatever point of view we come from. It can be the programs that we offer, it can be the advocacy we do, or the choices that we're making as an institution. So the three areas that I am looking at specifically are programs, advocacy, and how we run our organizations and the policies and procedures that we put in place. And I'm going to look at these through the vision of healthy livelihoods, strong health systems, particularly at the community level, and ensuring that all children are learning safely. So just to tackle the last one quickly, because I think it's already been mentioned, Joseph talked about a lot of us have shifted to working from home. This is one way we've been able to hopefully improve our footprint, our carbon footprint, and all organizations can think about what they're doing in terms of policies and procedures. We at Save the Children are looking at carbon baselining of where we are and set some targets of where we would like to be. I think we can think about our supply chains, where we procure items from, how can we reduce the footprint of bringing things from a long distance when a lot of things can be traded for locally produced or locally available goods where it makes sense. I think we can also look at our use of plastics in any activities that we're doing. We've now put into all our contracts with hotels and venue providers. We will not use plastic water bottles. Can you please offer us water dispensers and other things? So I'm going to park that and let you think about what your organization or who you work with can do to protect our environment. And I'm going to focus narrowly on programs and advocacy. So at Save the Children, we realize after talking to children and caregivers around the world that we really need to ensure that we have, that all children have access to strong, resilient, and equitable health and nutrition systems. And I think this really starts with the community base and being able to refer, particularly around something like COVID, but really being able to access your health services in the community. And this links into the One Health initiative that many of you have heard spoken about, where when we look at health in the community, it can't just be the people who are healthy, it has to be also the livestock and the wildlife and the nature around us, because that often provides the nutrition that we need. I think Alice talked about indigenous vegetables. We know from our work that children rely on the milk value chain that is produced by camels and cattle and goats, and also the protein sources that are available in the community. So by keeping a healthy wildlife population and a healthy vegetation and agriculture protection, we can ensure the health more at the community level. Our work also tells us that access to learning and a safe return to learning is going to be fundamental. How does this, relate to what we're trying to do in the conservation space? Well, if children are educated about the environment and have an opportunity to access and discuss what's going on in conservation, they are going to be the ones who are driving the policies, making the political decisions of the future. And since we have, particularly in Africa, such a large youth population coming up, I think investment in education will only bear fruits with not only teaching children with the core curriculum about conservation, but allowing them to engage in clubs and activities that allow them to take responsibility for that. And that links in also with healthy water and sanitation systems. We know that this is particularly important not only for COVID, but it's also important for the healthy environment at the school and in the community. So engaging in those healthy water systems and ensuring that children have access to potable water, but also that we have sanitation facilities that help us take care of some of the diseases that we're facing right now. But more importantly, and I think the big one, the big elephant in the room, not to use a conservation joke, is the livelihood situation. What is the livelihood situation that allows children to not only access healthcare and education, but allows families to be resilient? And I think this has been a challenge for all of us over the years. Do we just shift out of things that may have negative consequences on the environment into other activities, or can we actually enhance the whole economic environment in communities? And one of the things that Save the Children has found is having shock responsive social protection mechanisms in place, ensuring that the most marginalized, those households and families that cannot meet their food security needs and their basic economic needs, have some way to access either a cash transfer or a reliable source of income is important. But we also need to build that to be shock responsive, so that when there is a change or when things shift in the community, that we can either expand the number of people who the social protection platform provides for, or increase the amount of the transfer. We see this during floods, droughts, locust invasions. How can we increase the amount that communities and individual households can access to cushion through these times when their regular livelihoods are impacted, particularly in agriculture and in livestock? So I would argue that we can work together to ensure that we have healthy health systems, both for the environment, but also for the children and the communities that we support and work with, that we need to ensure that children have access to education, and particularly that we are building really what we would like to see as a universal child benefit that provides for all children, but that is shock responsive and that it can flex when we see these shocks to communities. I think we also need to recognize that the mental health issues are strong, that gender-based violence also contributes to negative effects across the community. Most of all, I hope that we redouble our efforts to really engage with communities. And I like the way that Josephat showed that, we need to be working with what the needs are in the community, what communities are already taking action around, and how can we support that. And then also use our advocacy efforts at the highest levels to make sure that there's the policies in place and that they are enforced and funded to be able to do that community work. So I'll pause there because I know there's a lot of questions. I see some questions coming into the Q&A. Save the Children is very excited to engage with other actors. And maybe I just throw out the question is, how can we break down some of our silos so that conservation and humanitarian and development actors are working more effectively together? Thank you. Thank you for everyone who's listening in.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for bringing some very relevant perspectives. And especially for bringing it together as One Health. When I first heard the program of One Health, because you read it in different articles, I fully thought it was just about sort of medical health and for children. But listening to what you're sharing, it's health for all. It's health for livestock. It's health for the land. It's health for the people. It's health for wildlife. So truly, to answer your question simplistically, but not because it's simple, there is space for us to really be one effort. Perspectives. I like also that you brought in the components of building shock absorbers, as we may call them, a way of enabling them to respond to the shocks of the system, be those climate, be those medical, be those economic, and to build the social frameworks that secure that. I think that's excellent. So I'd like to now go into the Q&As that we've been listening to, that have been listed, and see if we can get people, between the three panelists, have you respond to various ones of them and see how far we get before we start consolidating together. If that's in order, I'm going to start with the question that Natalie had asked, asking about how do we best support communities that are most affected by the economic downturn of the pandemic and depend so much on tourism that is nowhere near starting up again. And I think both Alice and Lisa really pointed out the need to look at diversification, and so did Josfat. And Lisa did make in her presentation, and she had answered right there that she'll talk about shock responses. And I think that's an area I'd want to open up to the panelists to discuss further, because the typical responses have sometimes been, if something's not working in conservation, stop doing that and do the other. If agriculture is a threat to environment, stop doing agriculture and go into some more conservation-based activities. But what we're saying is, how do we build a response to the shock where people are at and build the support frameworks to support them? So I'd like to ask that question to the three panelists. Maybe we'll start with Alice and then Josfat and then Lisa. But Alice, there's also a question around nature-based, community-based tourism. Again, the whole aspect of how do we help tourism support these communities who are resorting to poaching and bushmeat, as Josfat so ably showed us. Is there a way of financing this in the system to ensure that those adjacent protected areas are protected and supported for food and for health? And I think that goes back to what's the social protection mechanisms we can put in to support communities that depend on tourism when it's on a downturn. And then there was an observation by you, Alice, about the opportunities nature brings around payment for ecosystem services. And we need to recognize that there's a role there presented through digital inclusion. So as we talk about inclusion, not just inclusion by gender or inclusion by age, how do we take advantage of the digital space to offer more inclusion in the diversification we are proposing? So I know I've thrown three big ones out at you, but if we could start with Alice and then Lisa to really speak to those three components, because they are heavily related, and see how you would like on to the plans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you to my fellow panelists as well for the very interesting presentations, and the participants also who are listening and the interesting questions. Tourism, yes, tourism. That is the big what is the $64 million question. We know, I mean, tourism has been a big mainstay for our economies, and I think what's important also about tourism is it's not just a source of conservation finance. I mean, tourism is also provides multiplier effects throughout the entire economy. In fact, I think I saw $1 it results into feeds. I don't know, the people who get money feed, I don't know how many, 14 families. There's a whole study that was done on this. But also that money it goes into national treasuries, and it pays for education, and it pays for health. And so tourism is big. It is not just about these communities who are suffering right now. And I think one of the ways to thing to start looking at this is really to talk to our governments as well, because our governments have benefited from this income. It hasn't just kept protected areas in operations and paid for rangers and communities living around them. It has also benefited government. And I've seen some governments, I think the government of Kenya in particular, I have seen put forward some financing for this, and a few others. I think there's a lot of work that we need to do in advocating for some of the recovery packages that are being put forward to come to tourism. And I think there's a lot of I'm hearing a lot of rhetoric around this. I think there's a lot of recognition, because I mean, really, tourism has been the second highest foreign exchange earner in many countries here in Africa, only behind remittances, which obviously also have disappeared. So I see the need there for talking to governments. I see the need for emergency funds, to support emergency funds, but also I see then the bigger need for also diversification. And I think I mentioned this earlier, and you, Lisa, mentioned that earlier. It's not that we don't want tourism. It's not that we want tourism to go away, but I think it's an opportunity now to also rethink that model. I think we have been quite dependent on this model. It has served us, but as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown, it is not shock-proof. It is not quite as resilient as we want it to be. And therefore, looking at opportunities either through local tourism, looking at opportunities, I've seen a lot of people doing virtual tourism as well, looking at opportunities that may bring in these payments for ecosystem services that for tourism that don't necessarily require travel. Is a big one to look at. We also have to be honest about some issues on how far, whether that income was reaching everyone. There's a lot of things that we need to fix. There's issues around the footprint that Lisa talked about, the footprint that is involved in travel. So we do need to re-look a little bit at that sector and diversify, but also get really support from our governments to support that. Did I miss something else? I think Lucy, that is I'll start there anyway. Let me let Lisa
Excellent.
Say something more. Maybe I'll say a little bit about a platform that we, but in particular, are putting together to support to connect the funding, the emergency funding that's available to the communities at the last mile that need that funding. And that is something that we're trying to put together. It's a partnership that WWF has with the GEF. They're very interested in seeing how that could happen, because we realized early enough at the beginning that there was a lot of money out there being offered to support emergency loss from tourism. But then not everyone was in on where that money was. And there was who needs the money and who's providing the money. So we're trying to use this platform to connect that, and happy for people to contact me to talk to them a little bit about that. But now over to Josephat and Lisa, who may have better ideas than mine.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you for that useful contribution. Josephat, your response is also very appreciated.
Thank you, Alice. I'm not sure that our responses are better than yours. I think you have done a great job, and we appreciate you. I appreciate my colleague Lisa as well, and all the participants. I want to acknowledge and appreciate Edwin Sabuhoro, conserving gorillas in Rwanda, and also Luis Bandamawe from South Africa, doing humane education work. And I appreciate your questions, and any other questions that have been asked, we appreciate them. So just jumping right into it, one of the questions in the research that I did with communities asked what they wanted, and overwhelming majority of them say they don't want cash. They don't want hands out. What they really want is to be empowered. They want to be part and parcel of conservation initiatives. They say that they have something to offer, and they want to offer what they have. And really, that said, I think it's time policymakers see how they can bring them on board. When it comes to tourism, wildlife revenues in whichever way, let them be part and parcel of that. Let them come to the table, let them see a benefit that trickles in to them. And what came out very strongly, I think, was empowerment. They want to be able to do things, not just have a one-off gain. No, they want to be able to have sustainable income that can send their children to school, that they can count on to invest and be better economically. So that is, and looking at the diversification, your question, Edwin, is that besides there is they want a training that would encompass all other vocations. Call them like they want to be electricians, they want to be plumbers, they want to be engineers, and they're looking at that formal education to excel. Many of them cannot even afford school fees. So if some of our organizations would seek to empower those the bright children from the communities to get education, then that will be better. And yes, combining with Luis's ask, yes, we will be willing to partner in whichever way to ensure that the children are educated, and I think the key here is, of course, conservation and education, formal education, which would lead to them getting employed or self-employed. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Josephat. Thank you, Josephat, and especially for showing an expanded perspective of inclusiveness. It's not just about sharing benefits. It's really them being part and parcel of a solution for sustainability. A very useful perspective. All right, Lisa, over to you.
It's hard to add more to these really important comments that my fellow panelists have made, but I think building on that concept of localization and really understanding what's happening in communities and empowering them to be part of the policy dialogue. One of the things that Save the Children works on, and I think all of us can be working on, is how do we elevate the voices to decision makers in the local government, but also at higher levels, and being able to reflect those. We work a lot with youth and children on ensuring that their voices are heard, and I think we can all do that better and engage in those advocacy dialogues that will ensure that everybody is part of the decision-making process. But I think to build a little bit more on the livelihoods side and thinking about, we often try to solve the problem after the problem has happened. And it's hard to predict everything that's going to happen, but we do know that droughts, floods, other disasters can come to our communities. And more we're trying to work in talking to individuals, children, schools, and communities about early action and how can you plan for the types of events that will come or the crises that will change the course of the livelihood situation. And many times this is, for tourism, a really sensitive one. But some of the early actions that we're seeing is that people are starting to look at using the use of local community savings groups to be able to save for the future so that when there are shocks, they can cover those costs. So while they are, reaping benefits in a livelihood situation, they can save for shocks in the future, or they can save to invest in other mechanisms that allow them to diversify their income. So I visited women in northern Kenya recently, actually pre-COVID. It seems like it was recently, but that was actually 6 or 7 months ago, and saw the savings associations that they had put together. And this had really allowed them to diversify into new areas, to have other income sources. And the interesting thing about that is, although these were focused on women, and I think one of the issues that you highlighted, Lucy, is gender and use of digital. So these women were using their phones more, but they had really included men from the community to understand what this is about. And I think we have to ensure that all voices are heard. The impacts on women and men can be different, and they are also engaged in different aspects of development. When we're talking about water sources and use of water, when we're talking about choices around selling livestock, all of this requires us to think about men and women both. And so I think it's really important that gender is brought into our conversation. And I just liked the examples that we've used where we've seen from the other panelists where digital allowed us to continue to deliver things. And I think more and more, not only delivering whether it be cash or opportunities, but information, and then also collecting voices and using the digital platforms so that people can speak into situations. So if we can't get out to all the most remote communities or in areas where we don't have a footprint, how can we use digital platforms to solicit input, to inform the policy dialogues, but also to get feedback on what's going on in communities. One of our programs in Zimbabwe, really interestingly, has been using drone technology to look at vegetation and water sources. So using the drones to look at are water sources drying up, or are they flooding? Is vegetation performing, and our rainfall patterns normal? And then they're transferring that information into digital kiosks in communities where farmers and community members can come and get information. They can also get information on their phone. So I think anything we can use with the digital space that can support the information and communication is also very important. I'll stop there because I know there might be other questions, and we're nearing the end of our time together. Thank you.
Hello, Lisa. Can you hear me? Okay, I wasn't sure whether you finished because you froze a bit on my screen towards the end. After talking about the drones that check on your water sources, was that your sort of final contribution? I wasn't sure whether my system froze or yours.
I was just affirming that digital solutions that can also not only share information, but also collect input from communities. So yeah, as long as that we can have that two-way dialogue, and we can also use it as a source of training and short videos. And I mean, a lot of people are doing really creative things. We think that the digital footprint and the mobile connectivity isn't as good as it actually is. And so if you do talk to some of the phone companies, I mean, you find in a place like Kenya, almost 80 to 85% of the people have access to a mobile phone. It may not be a smartphone, but there is a lot more connectivity than you realize. I understand that it's not so in all locations. You can go to remote Ethiopia and South Sudan, but there is more and more an opportunity. And I think within the next 5 years, we will see a real transformation in our ability to be more digitally connected. So I will give over. I know there's other questions and other things that we want to cover, and we have a short time. All right.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. And I think the one point there, especially about leveraging the digital opportunity, has a lot of resonance with the participants. We have a comment from Pauline Kalunda, who talked about communities that they work with who translate their payment for ecosystem services transfer on a digital platform that ensures everyone then can get what is due to them, even if there's movement restrictions. And I think we haven't even begun to scratch the surface on what we can do with the digital space. We also have a comment from Louise van der Merwe, I'm not sure I pronounced it well, from South Africa, who says, and this is to you, of interest to you, I'm sure, Josephat, they have online lesson plans in humane education. And in the last 6 months, they've had over 2,460 teachers sign up. That's a wider reach than we could have had by going classroom to classroom. So indeed, there's an opportunity there for collaboration of people who've already developed programs that others can utilize, and they're looking for ways to reach out and connect. And then there's a comment from Edith Kahubire, who says she loves the webinar and she's thinking of the tangible areas of integration, which is great. I think we've seen many possibilities through what everyone has shared this afternoon. And she's specifically looking at data. whether it's information that people can access together or information people can collect and provide to others. How can we have integration around data, especially around enabling a harmonized approach to addressing issues of equality and equity? We need to plan how to do this, and you're absolutely right, Edith. And I think even as we ask if there are any other questions, I'll ask that our sort of synthesizing speaker, who will be Michael O'Brien, might want to speak to that issue of how do we harmonize better around information. Information is no longer just power. Information is powerful and enables people to leapfrog. And I'm thinking also from everything you've shared here today and looking at building back better, the ability to look at future scenarios is going to be one of the spaces we must look into. How does the data and information we have today help us look at the possible scenarios for tomorrow, for 5 years, for 10 years? And how can looking at those scenarios help us plan better now for that unknown tomorrow, which is going to have a lot of, one thing we don't know what will happen tomorrow, but we know there will be shocks in the system, whatever that shock will be. How can we use that information to help us plan for the future? So I'd want to see if there's a comment from the floor that anyone might want to make, or a question we didn't answer, but I would like to give Michael O'Brien an opportunity to help synthesize what we're hearing about what the panelists have said, what the participants are asking in terms of very, very insightful questions. And none of those has a linear answer. And I think that's the beauty of this webinar. The answers are about integration and seeing how better we collaborate and building back better and building forward will not be effective if we don't find ways to integrate around information, around approaches, around tools, across sectors. And so, Michael, I'd like to give you a chance now, maybe about 5 or 6 minutes, to sort of give your high-level synthesis of everything you've heard. And then I'll come back to the participants. So if you have questions, we're still going to have another 3 minutes for some wrap-up questions before I give the panelists half a minute each to sort of give a closing remark. So can I hand over to you, Michael? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Moderator Lucy. Thanks so much to the able panelists, Alice, Josh, and Lisa. And thanks so much to the participants for making the time to join in. In view of the time, and also the questions, the compelling questions that were asked, in view of the short time, and honestly, Lucy, you've done a great job in summarizing, as the panelists were, soon after they presented, you kind of summed up some of the things they've said. And the panelists have also answered a lot of the questions. I will try to address the specific one about harmonizing better around data. But in a nutshell, I think we've had a very rich and diverse but integrated range of topics addressed by the panelists. So Alice started by looking at building back better through a green and just recovery, which is very apt, you know, like on point, considering the environment we are living in right now because of COVID, the COVID pandemic. She looked at, you know, how Africa is experiencing what she calls the triple challenge. But interestingly, and more importantly, that despite all these challenges, there is hope for Africa centered around nature in terms of moving towards a good recovery. And she gave really compelling hard facts and figures, and that was really interesting. She ended up by saying the time is now, which I totally subscribe to. Josh, you know, looked at building back better, but from the people and communities perspective, including that compelling video clip that was quite touching and brought everything to kind of made it more real and not too abstract. Josh specifically looked at adaptive leadership in time of a pandemic, taking a look from his own organization in terms of the pay cuts they took, the acceptance of the COVID reality, and so on, and then went on to look at how local incidents usually end up being a global challenge. And I think that was quite interesting, because when you talk about nature and conservation, it's localized in a specific place, be it in the Mara or Ambuda in Madagascar or anywhere. But if those key reservoirs of nature, those ecosystems are not protected, it's a typical case of what happens in Vegas does not stay in Vegas in this case. So if we don't protect nature, what I took from that is that if we don't protect nature everywhere, we might end up having more and more of this kind of pandemic. Lisa, took a look at what's called the One Health, and I was in the same boat with you, like Lucy, when I thought, okay, One Health, it will be, One Health, and then maybe children. But when she explained it, I'm like, wow, it's healthy communities, healthy people, healthy wildlife, healthy nature, all integrated, all linked together, and that it's in our enlightened self-interest to ensure that there is this harmony and that this health prevails across for us to keep on moving forward. But she also specifically kept on highlighting about the need, to build the shock absorbers for communities, the need to double down on our efforts, particularly when it comes to children and the wider community members. And I think the health for all issue is something we could look more closely and see how different organizations can begin to integrate that. I think it's a holistic approach, which is good. And those are some of the things I captured. I didn't want to repeat some of the things you've already mentioned, Lucy, in your commentaries. And then specific, in the interest of time, specific to the Q&A, the one about harmonizing better. That's a big challenge because from all we can see and hear from so many webinars and so many workshops we've all attended, so many books and reports, I don't think there is a lack of information or data on what is going on, be it on the state of nature or the state of community members or the resilience level of the communities or lack of it. But what I think is people have information overload, really, if you think about it. There's so much information. Where do you really go? So I think as NGO practitioners and leaders and organizations in the forefront of this fight, we could begin to look at creating a more integrated community of practice kind of thing, where we can bring together all this information, be it on animal welfare and so on, or the health of communities and children and wildlife, the numbers in terms of investing in nature and the return on investment, try to integrate this and bring them together into a more manageable space so that, a one stop or two stops that you can do and get a big picture. Because if you are on the government side, in the corridor of power, where do you even go to make informed decision? There's just too much. You will need a PhD research student to get all this information together. So the information are there. It's just that we haven't figured out how to integrate them
Can you hear Michael? Michael, are you there?
Frozen.
He's frozen. Simon or Evelyn, can you hear Michael?
No, we cannot hear Michael. I think his internet is not very strong right now. Oh, he's back.
Michael, are you back? We can't hear you now. You need to put on your mic.
Unmute.
Unmute. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry,
sorry.
I thought
So
I
sorry.
lost you. I don't know where you lost me. Did you get my last? Sorry, it's my internet.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. But it was probably for about 12 seconds, not too long.
Okay, so that's fine then.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And really great to be part of this discussion and to listen in. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And I think what Michael has left us with is really more of a challenge. This webinar cannot solve all the problems of how we are going to integrate and how we are going to enhance integration. But I think he's pointed out the fact that we need to build a community of practice that is bringing together the various sectors that need to integrate and needs to work together. Because information is available, there's definitely information overload. And to me, I don't know what the people in this panel participants think. This probably needs to be an ongoing conversation. I don't think we need to say we've had this webinar, we had great ideas, and off we go. How do we create an ongoing conversation that isn't about more data and more information, but it's about what do we now know and what do we do with what we know? The format of that in a non-COVID world maybe would be a physical meeting with people in small groups, figuring out some action plans, but I leave it to us to think innovatively on how can we bring ourselves together as the community that wants to bring the change, not by talking more about the need for integration, but actually by integrating in specific aspects of our program and piloting how that helps bring better, effective action and probably more resilient action, and I'm sure more sustainable outcomes. So I would really like to leave that as a challenge that we go home with and Evelyn, to all the planning team, how do we take this forward as an action platform in whatever form and shape it would be in the coming weeks or months, but to move from sharing information, availing what we know, yes, but how do we move that to actually some work that makes a difference on the ground across the different sectors. I think we cannot try and oversimplify what it takes, but I think we are the people. As Alice said, we seize the moment is now. I agree with her. I also want to say we are the people who must seize the moment now. So let's see how we pull this forward and actually have some action steps or processes that can really help us connect around the key themes we've talked about this afternoon. So I want to thank everyone. I'm so sorry we're out of time. It looks like we need 2 more hours, but I think it lends ourselves then to look for a way to reconnect again and move forward. I'd like to hand over back to you, Evelyn, in the interest of time, and perhaps you can guide us on how we both close this out and also what we can expect going forward. Thank you. Alice, and while we wait for Alice, someone has put a comment to the panelists that the ABCG, which is the Biodiversity Consultative Group, is a great community of practice, maybe just what I'm calling for. Maybe we do have the solution. We now need to get into action. I'm not prescribing, just reading what someone shared, but thank you again, and over to you, Evelyn.
No, I think, Lucy, you've concluded it well. So mine is just to say thank you, everybody. And we will be sharing with you the resources from this webinar after here to all the registered participants. If you've not dropped your email, you could share it at the chat box or share it later on with me, and we shall share with you the resources and also the how to continue the conversation moving forward as we have been challenged. So thank you again for joining us, and do enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Josephat. Thank you, Lisa. That was excellent. Thank you very much. And have a great evening.
And thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Michael.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.